In the sleepy town of Pine Valley Springs, what started as cruel harassment of an overweight teenage girl by the notorious Shadow Riders motorcycle gang turned into the biggest mistake of their lives. When they humiliated Amirah Roundhouse in Nishin's front of Carter's Market, forcing her to eat dirt while filming it on their phones, they never imagined it would bring her father home. A legendary ex-Green Beret with over 150 successful combat missions who was about to teach them an unforgettable lesson about bullying. Now back to where it all began. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn leaves danced along Main Street as Amirah Roundhouse walked toward Carter's Market, her heart heavy with the familiar dread that had become her daily companion. At 17, she'd learned to navigate the cruel whispers and sideways glances that followed her through Pine Valley Springs, a skill no teenager should have to master. Her hands clutched the grocery list her mother had given her, a simple errand that felt like walking through a minefield. The old brass bell above Carter's Market's door chimed as Amirah entered, the familiar scent of fresh produce and penny candy offering a momentary comfort. Mr. Carter himself stood behind the counter, his kind eyes crinkling at the corners as he nodded to her. "Morning, Sarah. Your mom's apple pie season starting early this year?" Amirah managed a small smile, grateful for the normalcy of the interaction. "Yes, sir. Says the first cold snap means it's time." She moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, gathering ingredients while trying to make herself as inconspicuous as possible, a challenge she'd faced since elementary school. Through the store's front window, she caught sight of several motorcycles rolling past, their riders, wearing the distinctive shadow and chain emblem of the Shadow Riders. Her heart rate quickened. The gang had appeared in Pine Valley Springs 3 months ago, bringing with them a wave of intimidation that had transformed their peaceful town. Officer Jenny Rodriguez, one of the town's few police officers, entered the store, her presence both reassuring and concerning. She'd been watching the gang's movements closely, but with only 6 officers on the force, there was only so much they could do. "Everything okay, Sarah?" she asked, casually positioning herself near the window. "Yes, Mom," Amirah replied, though they both knew it wasn't entirely true. The Shadow Riders had been escalating their presence in town, and somehow she'd become one of their favorite targets. Perhaps it was because she was vulnerable, or maybe because her father's military photos hung proudly in the town's Veteran Memorial Hall. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes, the high school librarian, hurried into the store, her usually composed demeanor slightly ruffled. She made her way to Sarah, keeping her voice low. "Honey, maybe you should wait a bit before heading out. Those men have been circling the block." Amirah glanced at her phone, checking the time. Her father would be calling for their daily chat soon, one of the few constants since he'd taken the private security consulting job that kept him away from home. Jack Roundhouse had raised her to be strong, to face her fears, but lately those fears had sharp teeth and leather jackets. The bell chimed again, but this time the atmosphere in the store shifted dramatically. Marcus "Shark" Thompson entered. First, his massive frame filling the doorway. Behind him came Eric "Viper" Peters and Ray "Bones" Martinez. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Mr. Carter's hand moved beneath the counter, where Amirah knew he kept an old baseball bat. Officer Rodriguez casually adjusted her stance, one hand near her holster, but they all knew she couldn't take on 3 gang members alone. Shark's gaze settled on Sarah, a predatory smile spreading across his face. "Well, look who we have here. Boys, the little piggy doing her shopping." His voice carried the cruel confidence of someone used to inflicting pain without consequences. Amirah clutched her shopping basket tighter, trying to remember her father's words about standing tall in the face of fear. But theory and practice were very different things when facing 3 grown men with malice in their eyes. You know what I love about small towns like this? Shark continued, picking up an apple from a nearby display and examining it. Everyone knows their place. Everyone understands the natural order of things. He took a bite of the apple, juice running down his chin. Strong prey on the weak. That's nature's law. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward. That's enough. You've made your point. Have we? Viper asked, his hand resting meaningfully on the chain hanging from his belt, because I think little Miss Piggy here needs a clearer lesson about her place in the food chain. Sarah's voice, when she finally spoke, carried a dignity that would have made her father proud. I'm just buying groceries. I don't want any trouble. Shark's face darkened. Trouble found you the day you decided to exist in our town, fat girl. He spat the apple onto the floor, the partially eaten fruit rolling to stop at Sarah's feet. Clean that up with your mouth. Mrs. Hayes gasped. Officer Rodriguez drew her weapon, but before she could speak, 2 more gang members entered behind. The odds had shifted dangerously. Now, Shark drawled. Let's not escalate this into something unfortunate. We're just having a friendly conversation about manners and respect. He kicked the apple closer to Sarah. Aren't we? Amirah felt tears burning behind her eyes, but refused to let them fall. Her father had taught her that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about standing your ground, even when you're terrified. But as she stood there, surrounded by cruelty, wearing leather vests, those lessons felt very far away. Through the window, more shadow riders arrived, their bikes forming a menacing barrier outside the store. Mr. Carter's hand tightened on his bat, but everyone knew any resistance would only make things worse. Your daddy's not here to protect you now, is he? Shark taunted, his voice dropping lower. The big bad Green Beret, off playing soldier somewhere while his little piggy gets pushed around at home. What do you think he'd say if he could see you now? Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, but she lifted her chin slightly. My father taught me that real strength isn't about hurting people who can't fight back. The blow came fast. Not a punch, but Shark knocking the shopping basket from her hands, sending groceries scattering across the floor. Your father's lessons stop mattering the moment they cross paths with our entertainment girl. As Amirah watched her carefully selected ingredients roll across the floor, she thought about her father, somewhere across the world. He'd raised her alone after her mother's death, taught her about courage, about standing up to bullies. But he'd also taught her about picking her battles, about surviving to fight another day. What happened next would test everything she believed about courage, dignity, and the true meaning of strength. The Shadow Riders thought they'd found an easy target in an overweight teenager. They were about to learn just how wrong they were, and just what happened when you pushed a Green Beret's daughter too far. Through the window, more motorcycles arrived, their engines drowning out the quiet of the autumn morning. Pine Valley Springs had faced its share of challenges, but nothing like the storm that was about to break. As Amirah stood her ground in Carter's Market, she couldn't know that her daily call with her father had already gone to voicemail, or that Jack Roundhouse was closer to home than anyone realized. The Shadow Riders were about to learn a harsh lesson about the difference between terrorizing the vulnerable and facing someone who'd spent their life training to protect them. But first, they were going to show everyone in Carter's Market just how cruel they could be, not realizing they were sealing their own fate with every moment of brutality. Amirah Roundhouse had always felt weight of others' judgments, but never quite like this. Shark's boots crunched over the scattered groceries as he circled her, a predator toying with prey. The Shadow Riders had transformed Carter's Market from a sanctuary of penny candy and fresh produce into an arena of cruelty, with Amirah at its center. Pick them up, Shark commanded, gesturing to the spilled items. One by one, on your hands and knees, where you belong. Officer Rodriguez's hand remained on her weapon, but with 4 gang members now inside and more visible through the windows, intervention meant risking a bloodbath. "This isn't necessary," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "Everything we do is necessary," Viper responded, pulling out his phone to record. "The world needs to see what happens when people don't show proper respect." Sarah's hands trembled as she knelt, reaching for a fallen apple. The linoleum floor was cold beneath her palms, decades of footsteps worn into its surface. As she moved to retrieve a bag of flour, Bones deliberately stepped on her fingers. Not hard enough to break them, but enough to make his point. Mr. Carter's knuckles were white around his baseball bat. "That's enough. She's just a child." "A child?" Shark laughed, the sound echoing off the shelves. "Nature doesn't care about age, only strength, only dominance." He kicked another apple across the floor. "Keep going, Piggy. Give us a show." Through the windows, more shadow riders gathered. Pine Valley Springs had watched their influence grow over the past months, spreading like poison through their once peaceful community. First it was just passing through, then lingering at local businesses. Then the protection money demands started. "Mrs." Hayes moved toward Sarah, but Viper blocked her path. "Stay back, Teach. This is an educational moment. Everyone needs to learn their place in our new order." Amirah reached for a carton of eggs, her father's words echoing in her mind. "Focus. On survival first," he'd always taught her. "Pride can heal, bones take longer." But as she crawled across the floor, each movement filmed by laughing gang members, she wondered if some wounds went deeper than bone. The bell above the door chimed again. Lisa Chen, Sarah's best friend since kindergarten, stood frozen in the entrance, taking in the scene. Her face shifted from shock to determination as she moved to step inside, but Officer Rodriguez subtly shook her head. "More casualties wouldn't help anyone." "Wider audience," Shark grinned, gesturing to Lisa. "Perfect timing. Come in, come in. Watch your friend show us what she's good for." Amirah felt tears threatening again, but held them back. The Shadow Riders had been escalating their harassment for weeks. First, it was just comments as they passed, then following her home from school, then accidentally bumping into her in public places. Each incident pushed the boundaries further, testing what they could get away with. Through the window, Tom Marshall from the hardware store watched helplessly, his phone to his ear. The whole town had been calling the state police about the gang, but help always seemed to arrive just after the Shadow Riders left. They were professional in their timing, careful to never cross lines that would bring serious law enforcement attention. "You know what would make this better?" Bones pulled a handful of dirt from a nearby potted plant. "A little seasoning for our pig." He sprinkled it over the scattered groceries Amirah was still trying to gather. Mrs. Hayes's voice cut through the tension. "She has a father who served this country with honor. When Daddy finds out what?" Shark interrupted. "That his little girl couldn't handle herself? That she needed him to fight her battles? Maybe if he'd spent more time teaching her about diet and exercise, instead of playing soldier, she wouldn't be in this position." Sarah's hand closed around a fallen can, her father's combat training lessons floating through her mind. She knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage, how to use her attacker's weight against them. But she also knew her father's most important lesson. True warriors choose their battles carefully. Sometimes the bravest thing is to endure. Officer Rodriguez spoke into her radio, but everyone knew backup wouldn't arrive in time. The Shadow Riders had studied Pine Valley Springs police patterns, knew exactly how long they had before response was possible. "Time for the finale," Shark announced, grabbing Sarah's hair and yanking her head back. "Eat it. Eat the dirt, little piggy. Show everyone what you are." Amirah caught Mr. Carter's movement before anyone else saw him starting to raise the bat. "Don't," she managed to say. "Please, I'm okay." She couldn't bear the thought of these men hurting someone else because of her. Viper's phone recorded everything as Shark forced Sarah's face toward the dirt-covered floor. "This is going viral, girl. Everyone's going to see what happens when you don't respect the natural order." The bell chimed one final time. Amirah couldn't see who entered, but she felt the atmosphere in the store shift dramatically. The Shadow Rider's laughter cut off abruptly, replaced by a tension she didn't understand. Let her go. The voice was quiet, controlled, carrying the kind of authority that didn't need volume to command attention. Amirah felt Shark's grip loosen, slightly more in surprise than compliance. "Mind your own business, old man," Viper warned, but his voice lacked its usual confidence. "My daughter is my business." Jack Roundhouse's voice remained calm, but Amirah knew that tone. It was the same one he used when teaching her about real danger, about situations where violence wasn't just possible, but probable. Shark released, Sarah's hair turning to face the newcomer. Jack Roundhouse stood in the doorway, his frame filling it not with bulk, but with presence. He wore simple civilian clothes, but his bearing spoke of decades of combat experience. Well, Shark tried to regain his dominant tone. "The prodigal father returns. Come to watch your daughter learn some valuable life lessons." "The only lesson being taught here," Jack replied, his eyes scanning the room with professional assessment, "is about the difference between cruelty and strength. A lesson you boys seem to need." Through the windows, more Shadow Riders were arriving, drawn by urgent text from their companions inside. They thought numbers would protect them, not realizing that to a Green Beret, more targets just meant more options. "You might want to check those odds again," Bones suggested, gesturing to the growing crowd outside. "One old soldier against all. Of us? Those aren't good numbers." Jack's smile was subtle but carried no warmth. "You're right, it's not fair." He took one step forward. "You should have brought more men." The tension in Carter's market stretched like a wire about to snap. Amirah watched her father, seeing not just her protector, but the warrior she knew him to be. The Shadow Riders had brought their brand of cruelty to Pine Valley Springs, thinking their numbers made them invincible. They were about to learn that some things were more dangerous than mere numbers, and that they'd made a terrible mistake when they targeted the daughter of a man who'd spent his life learning the true meaning of strength. In the charged atmosphere of Carter's market, Shark attempted to project confidence he no longer felt. "Big words from an old soldier, but this isn't your war zone. This is our town now." Jack Roundhouse's eyes never left Shark's face, but his awareness encompassed every movement in the store. His stance was relaxed but purposeful, decades of combat experience evident in his economy of motion. Interesting choice of words. War. The zone. Tell me, what's the heaviest combat you've seen, besides terrorizing teenage girls? Through the windows, more Shadow Riders arrived, their leather vests bearing patches that spoke of claimed territories and inflicted violence. Inside, Amirah slowly rose from the floor, her father's presence giving her strength she'd forgotten she possessed. "You don't want to do this, old man," Viper warned, though he'd unconsciously taken a step back. "We've got 30 brothers within. We're calling distance. You're just one man." "One Green Beret," Jack corrected quietly, "and you still haven't brought enough men." His eyes flickered to the patches on their vests. "Those marks you wear, the skulls, the territory claims, you play at being warriors, but real warriors protect the vulnerable. They don't prey on them." Officer Rodriguez maintained her position, recognizing in Jack's bearing something she'd seen in other combat veterans, the controlled readiness that preceded precise action. "Mr. Roundhouse," she began, "state police won't be necessary, officer," Jack interrupted softly. "These boys are about to leave, aren't you?" Shark's face darkened with rage. "You don't give orders here, soldier boy. This isn't the army anymore. This is the real world, where strength makes the rules." "That's your first mistake," Jack replied, thinking that cruelty equals strength. His gaze swept the other gang members. "The second was touching my daughter." Through the windows, Tom Marshall from the hardware store watched more motorcycles arrive. The Shadow Riders were gathering their full force, not realizing they were playing directly into a veteran's tactical assessment. Every new arrival gave Jack, more information about their numbers, their organization, their chain of command. Last chance, Shark announced, pulling out a heavy chain. Walk away. Forget what you saw here, or we make an example of both you and your pig of a daughter. The change in Jack's expression was subtle but profound. The quiet assessment vanished, replaced by something older and more dangerous. That chain, he said softly. You've used it on others, haven't you? Made yourself feel strong by hurting those who couldn't fight back. Amirah watched her father, seeing not just her protector, but the warrior she'd heard stories about, the man who'd led over 100 successful combat missions, who'd trained other soldiers in the art of turning disadvantages into victories. Let me tell you what's about to happen, Jack continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the store. First, you're going to drop that chain. Then you're going to apologize to my daughter. Finally, you're going to leave Pine Valley Springs and never return. Laughter erupted from the gang members, but it carried an edge of uncertainty. Something in Jack's calm certainty made their numerical advantage feel suddenly less reassuring. Or, what? Bones challenged, trying to circle behind Jack, not realizing the veteran had already calculated his movement pattern. Or I demonstrate the difference between playing warrior and being one. Jack hadn't moved, hadn't raised his voice, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop further. Shark made his decision, swinging the chain in a vicious arc toward Jack's head. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion to the watching crowd. Jack's movement was minimal, efficient, born of countless hours of training and combat experience. The chain wrapped around his forearm, exactly where he'd intended it to, and his counter-movement sent Shark stumbling forward, off balance and vulnerable. The next 3 seconds demonstrated why Green Berets were considered among the world's most dangerous close combat specialists. Shark found himself disarmed, on his knees, his own chain now pressed against his throat with precisely controlled pressure. That's one, Jack announced calmly. Who's next? Viper and Bones moved simultaneously, but their street-fighting tactics were crude compared to Jack's military precision. Each attack was met with economical counter-moves that turned their own momentum against them. No wasted motion, no dramatic flourishes, just the brutal efficiency of a combat veteran who'd spent decades learning to end fights quickly. Through the windows, the gathered Shadow Riders watched their leaders neutralized with professional ease. Some reached for weapons, but Jack's voice carried clearly. Think carefully. Your next decision determines whether you leave here under your own power or not. Mr. Carter still gripped his baseball bat, but now he watched with something like awe as 3 of the most feared men in town were systematically disassembled by one quiet veteran. Mrs. Hayes had her phone out, recording everything, not for entertainment like the gang had done to Sarah, but for evidence of their true nature. Here's what you don't understand. Jack addressed the downed gang members, his voice still calm and controlled. I've fought real battles against real enemies. I've faced men who were willing to die for their causes. You're just bullies who mistake cruelty for strength. Officer Rodriguez holstered her weapon, recognizing that the situation was now fully under control. Through the door, she could see other Shadow Riders beginning to back away, their confidence shattered by the sight of their leaders so easily defeated. Now, Jack continued, maintaining precise pressure on Shark's throat, about that apology to my daughter. Shark's face was purple with rage and restricted blood flow. Go to... The pressure increased slightly. Wrong answer. Let's try again. My daughter is waiting. I'm sorry, Shark managed, his voice strangled, for hurting her, for filming it, for everything. Jack looked at Sarah, his eyes softening slightly. Is that sufficient, sweetheart? Amirah stood straight, channeling her father's strength. Yes, Dad, that's enough. With precise movements, Jack released his holds on the gang members. Remember this moment, he told them, as they struggled to their feet. Remember what real strength looks like. It's not about hurting those who can't fight back, it's about protecting them. Through the windows, the gathered Shadow Riders watched their leaders stumble out, their aura of invincibility shattered. But this wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. The gang had built their reputation on fear and violence. They wouldn't let this humiliation go unanswered. But as Jack helped Amirah gather undamaged groceries from the floor, his movements calm and practiced, it was clear that Pine Valley Springs had changed. The Shadow Riders had brought their brand of cruelty to a peaceful town, thinking their numbers made them unstoppable. They were about to learn that they'd started a war they couldn't win, against a man who'd spent his life mastering the art of turning predators into prey. The real battle for Pine Valley Springs was just beginning, and Jack Roundhouse was about to teach them exactly why Green Berets were considered among the most dangerous soldiers in the world. The first effects of Jack Roundhouse's return to Pine Valley Springs manifested within hours. The Shadow Riders, their intimidating presence suddenly diminished, retreated to their compound on the outskirts of town. But changes were already rippling through the community in subtle, significant ways. "They're planning something," Officer Rodriguez reported during an impromptu meeting at Chen's diner, where Lisa's parents had offered their backroom as a gathering place. Called in reinforcements from 3 other chapters. About 40 more bikes crossed the county line in the last 2 hours. Jack sat with military precision, his coffee untouched as he absorbed the information. Amirah watched her father's face, recognizing the tactical assessment in his eyes, the same look he'd worn in countless photographs from his service days. "They'll try to re-establish dominance," he observed quietly. "Their entire power structure depends on fear. Once that's challenged, they have to respond dramatically or lose everything they've built." Through the diner's windows, they could see the town's subtle transformation. Where people had hurried fearfully past Shadow Rider gatherings, they now walked with cautious confidence. The gang's spell of intimidation had been broken, at least temporarily. Lisa Chen approached their table, carrying fresh coffee. 3 more businesses called, she reported, having become an unofficial intelligence gatherer through her family's diner. The protection payments they were forcing on people, everyone's refusing to pay now. "That's going to trigger them," Tom Marshall added, joining the discussion. The hardware store owner's face showed the strain of recent weeks. "They've been using those payments to fund their operation. Without that money, they'll escalate," Jack finished, his voice carrying the weight of experience, but not randomly. They're led by ex-military, dishonorable discharges most likely, but still trained. They'll follow a pattern. Sarah's hand tightened around her water glass. "How do you know they're ex-military?" "Their organization," Jack explained. "The systematic way they took over the town, territory marking, psychological warfare, strategic pressure points. These aren't common thugs. They're applying military tactics, just twisted to serve their own purposes." Officer Rodriguez's radio crackled with updates. More Shadow Riders were arriving, their presence growing despite their leader's humiliation at Carter's Market. But something had changed in their behavior. Their movements were more coordinated, more purposeful. "They're scouting," Jack noted, watching 2 bikes pass the diner for the 3rd time. "Mapping defensive positions, identifying targets, classic insurgency tactics." Mrs. Hayes entered through the back door, her librarian's demeanor now focused on a different kind of record-keeping. "They've started marking properties," she reported, spreading photos on the table. "Not their usual tags. These are different, more military. Grid references, tactical annotations." Jack studied the images, his expression darkening. "They're preparing for a systematic operation. This isn't just about revenge anymore. They're treating Pine Valley Springs like a battlefield." Through the windows, they watched another pair of Shadow Riders pass, these ones wearing different patches, visiting members bringing their own reputation for violence. The gang was gathering its forces, preparing to remind the town why they should be feared. "We need to evacuate," Officer Rodriguez suggested, but Jack shook his head. "That's what they want. Empty streets, isolated targets, makes their job easier." His eyes never left the passing bikes. "No, we need to change the battlefield, make them fight on our terms." Amirah recognized the shift in her father's demeanor, the transition from protective parent to tactical commander. She'd seen it before, in the videos he'd sent home from deployment, in the way he'd taught her to handle bullies and threats. "Got more information," Lisa reported, returning to their table. "They've been asking questions about you, Mr. Roundhouse. Your service record, your combat history, they're taking this seriously." "Good," Jack replied simply. "That means they're afraid. Fear makes them predictable." Tom Marshall shifted uncomfortably. "We've got 6 police officers against, 70 gang members now. Those aren't good odds." A subtle smile crossed Jack's face, reminiscent of his expression in Carter's Market. "Numbers don't win battles. Strategy does. And they're about to learn why Green Berets specialize in asymmetric warfare." The meeting continued as afternoon faded toward evening, with more town members arriving to share information and seek guidance. Jack listened to each report, building a comprehensive picture of the Shadow Riders' operation. "They've got supply lines through 3 counties, Mrs. Hayes explained, her librarian's research skills now focused on gang activities. Weapons, drugs, stolen goods, all moving through established routes. Pine Valley Springs was supposed to be their proof of concept, show they could control an entire community. Now they have to demonstrate that control absolutely," Jack concluded, "or their whole network collapses." Amirah watched her father absorb the information, seeing him piece together the larger picture. The Shadow Riders had brought their version of warfare to Pine Valley Springs, never expecting to encounter someone who understood real combat. "First, we gather intelligence," Jack explained, laying out a methodical plan. Their movements, their communication patterns, their command structure. Then we start dismantling their operation piece by piece. Officer Rodriguez leaned forward. "How? We're massively outnumbered." "That's their second mistake," Jack replied, thinking this is about numbers. Green Berets specialize in force multiplication, turning smaller units into devastating fighting forces through superior tactics and local support. Through the diner's windows, more Shadow Riders passed, their presence growing more ominous with each circuit. But where they expected to see fear in watching eyes, they found calculation instead. Jack Roundhouse wasn't just protecting his daughter. Anymore, he was preparing to teach Pine Valley Springs how to protect itself. "They've called in their best fighters," Lisa reported, bringing another update. "Real scary guys with serious records. They're treating this like a war." "That's their third mistake," Jack said quietly. "They're fighting the last war, thinking intimidation and violence are their best weapons. They're about to learn about a different kind of warfare, one they're not prepared for." As night approached, the Shadow Riders' presence grew more pronounced. They were sending a message, showing the town that one man, no matter how skilled, couldn't stand against their combined force. But in Chen's diner, Jack Roundhouse continued, gathering intelligence and forming plans, his military experience transforming civilian reports into actionable intelligence. The gang had brought their version of warfare to a peaceful town. Now they were about to experience what real combat operations felt like, delivered by a man who'd spent his life mastering the art of unconventional warfare. "Remember," Jack told the gathered townspeople, "they expect us to fight like civilians, to be disorganized, to panic. That's their weakness. They've forgotten the first rule of combat. The enemy you understand least is often the most dangerous." The Shadow Riders had started this war thinking their numbers and brutality made them invincible. They were about to learn why Green Berets were considered masters of turning overwhelming odds into decisive victories. The Shadow Riders' first major show of force came at midnight. 20 bikes roared through Pine Valley Springs' main street, their riders wearing full tactical gear instead of their usual leather vests. They were sending a message. This wasn't a gang anymore. This was an army preparing for war. Right on schedule, Jack Roundhouse observed from the darkened interior of Chen's diner, where he'd established an informal command center. They're following standard intimidation protocols. First show of force is always about psychological impact. Amirah watched from beside her father as the gang members circled the town, their movements precise and coordinated. They're different now, she noted, more organized. Their real leadership's taken over, Jack explained, his eyes tracking patterns invisible to civilian observers. The ones we dealt with at Carter's Market were just the local muscle. These are their combat veterans, men who learned military tactics before turning criminal. Officer Rodriguez entered through the back door, her uniform dusty from patrolling back roads. They've set up checkpoints on all major routes into town. Professional work, overlapping fields of view, elevated positions, communication relays. Through the diner's windows, they watched another group of riders pass, these ones moving slower, examining buildings and alleyways with tactical precision. Their vests bore new patches, combat unit insignias, partially covered by gang symbols. Third, Rangers, Jack identified quietly. 10th Mountain Division, Force Recon. They're not just criminals, they're corrupted warriors. Men who took their combat training and twisted it to serve darkness instead of light. Lisa Chen moved efficiently through the diner, maintaining its normal operation even as it served as their observation post. Dad says they visited earlier, tried to pressure him about special deliveries coming through next week, used military terms, talked about supply lines and distribution networks. Not just taking over the town, Jack concluded. They're setting up a major operation. Pine Valley Springs isn't their target, it's their proving ground. Show they can control an entire community, then expand from there. Amirah recognized the shift in her father's demeanor, the tactical commander emerging from behind the protective parent. He'd taught her about this side of him, about how Green Berets were trained to think differently about warfare. First team in position. Tom Marshall's voice crackled through a secure radio channel Jack had established. The hardware store owner and other trusted townspeople had been positioned as observers, creating a network of eyes across the community. Movement. At the north checkpoint, Mrs. Hayes reported from her position in the library. They're establishing a command center in the old mill. Professional setup, generators, communication equipment, security perimeter. Jack absorbed the information with military efficiency, building a comprehensive picture of the enemy's operation. They're following standard insurgency protocols, secure key infrastructure, establish command and control, demonstrate overwhelming force. Through the windows, more Shadow Riders arrived, their equipment speaking of serious investment. Night vision gear, tactical communications, military-grade weapons barely concealed under leather jackets. They'd brought their full arsenal, determined to crush any resistance. Got more intel, Officer Rodriguez reported, returning from another patrol. Their leaders arrived, Marcus Ironthorn, ex-Special Forces, dishonorably discharged for selling tactical training to criminal organizations. He's brought his entire command staff. Jack's expression showed recognition. Thorn. Should have known. We crossed paths in Afghanistan. He was already showing signs of corruption back then. Thought power was more important than purpose. Night deepened as the Shadow Riders continued their show of force. Each pass through town displayed more of their strength, their resources, their professional training. They weren't just trying to intimidate anymore. They were establishing military control. Surveillance teams on the high school roof, Lisa reported, returning from serving coffee to legitimate customers. They're mapping lines of sight, identifying defensive positions, using military hand signals, professional equipment. Classic Special Forces tactics, Jack noted. Control the high ground, establish overwatch positions, gather tactical intelligence, but they've forgotten the most important lesson from their training. What's that? Amirah asked, watching another group of riders pass. The most dangerous enemy isn't the one with the most weapons. It's the one who knows how you think. The Shadow Riders' operation continued to unfold with military precision. Teams moved through town methodically, marking buildings, establishing patrol routes, identifying key tactical positions. They were transforming Pine Valley Springs into a fortress, never realizing they were being watched with equal professional assessment. They're expecting resistance, Jack explained to the gathered observers, but they're expecting civilian resistance, disorganized, emotional, predictable. They've forgotten how to fight an opponent who understands their playbook. Officer Rodriguez studied the patrol patterns. How do we fight this many trained combat veterans? They've got every tactical advantage. A subtle smile crossed Jack's face. That's their first mistake, thinking tactical advantages win wars. Green Berets specialize in turning disadvantages into victories. Everything they see as strength will turn into weakness. Through the diner's windows, Ironthorn himself made an appearance, his bearing marking him as different from the ordinary gang members. He moved with the calculated precision of a combat veteran, his eyes constantly scanning for threats. He's good, Jack acknowledged. Professional, dangerous, but he's fighting the last war, thinking his military training makes him invincible. He's about to learn why Green Berets are considered masters of unconventional warfare. The night wore on as the Shadow Riders established their control. More equipment arrived, vehicles carrying supplies, communications gear, everything needed. For a prolonged operation, they were preparing for war, but fighting blind against an enemy they didn't understand. Remember, Jack told his network of observers, they expect us to react like civilians, to be scared, to be predictable. That's their weakness. They've forgotten the first rule of asymmetric warfare. The enemy you underestimate is the most dangerous one. Amirah watched her father coordinate the town's response, seeing not just the protective parent who'd defended her at Carter's Market, but the warrior who'd spent decades mastering the art of unconventional combat. The Shadow Riders had brought their version of military force to Pine Valley Springs. Now they were about to experience what real Special Forces operations felt like. Phase 1 begins at dawn, Jack announced quietly. They want to play soldier? Let's show them what real warriors can do. The Shadow Riders had started this war thinking their numbers and training made them unstoppable. They were about to learn why Green Berets were considered experts at turning overwhelming odds into decisive victories, and why targeting a Special Forces veteran's daughter was the biggest mistake they could have made. The first sign that something had changed in Pine Valley Springs came when the Shadow Riders' morning supply truck failed to arrive. Ironthorn's rage echoed through the old mill as he questioned his lieutenants, none of whom could explain how their carefully planned route had been compromised. Someone redirected the entire shipment, Viper reported nervously, his earlier bravado replaced by growing uncertainty. All the paperwork was perfect, but somehow every checkpoint got different routing instructions. Professional work. Through the diner's windows, Jack watched the gang's morning patrols, noting how their previously precise formations had begun to show signs of strain. They're reactive now, he observed quietly to Sarah, who hadn't left his side since his return. Operating on instinct instead of training. That's when professionals make mistakes. 3 bikes down this morning, Officer Rodriguez reported during their dawn briefing at Chen's diner. Someone drained their gas tanks overnight, didn't damage anything, just emptied them. These weren't street thugs. This was methodical. Lisa, Chen moved efficiently through the diner, which maintained its normal operation while serving as their observation post. They tried checking their supply chain records, she whispered, while refilling coffee cups. Everything scrambled, Shipping manifests, routing numbers, authorization codes, all mysteriously altered. Jack's expression remained neutral, but Amirah recognized the subtle satisfaction in his eyes. The Green Beret had spent the night implementing the first phase of his counter-operation, using the gang's own professional structure against them. Found their surveillance photos scattered across 3 counties, Tom Marshall reported, joining them with fresh intelligence. All their careful reconnaissance, their tactical planning, just gone. No traces, no prints, just their entire intelligence. Operation in the wind. Through the windows, they watched Iron Thorn himself inspect the disabled motorcycles, his military bearing evident in his methodical approach. "Someone knows our protocols," he growled to his lieutenants. "This isn't civilian interference. This is professional counter-tactics." The morning brought more signs of invisible resistance. The Shadow Riders' sophisticated communication system began experiencing mysterious failures. Their encrypted channels picked up ghost transmissions, random numbers, military codes, fragments of conversations that meant nothing but kept them from coordinating effectively. "They're getting sloppy," Mrs. Hayes observed from her position in the library, watching gang members argue among themselves. "Their professional discipline is cracking. They're starting to doubt each other." Amirah studied her father as he coordinated their network of observers, seeing the tactical commander who'd led over 100 successful combat missions. The Shadow Riders had brought military precision to Pine Valley Springs, never expecting to encounter someone who'd mastered their tactics at a higher level. "Someone accessed their supply records," Lisa reported, bringing another update. "All their approved vendors are getting anonymous tips about criminal enterprises and federal investigations. Their entire network is unraveling." Jack's phone buzzed, with updates from his own network of contacts, fellow veterans and intelligence specialists who'd responded to his call for support. "Phase 1 proceeding as planned," he noted quietly. "Containment and isolation established. Ready to begin. Dismantling their organization." Iron Thorn's voice carried across the street as he berated his men for their failures. "Find out who's interfering with our operation. Find out who's talking to who. This is professional work. Someone with military training is targeting us." Specifically, the Shadow Riders' command structure showed increasing signs of strain. Their morning patrols, once precisely coordinated, became erratic and defensive. Equipment continued to malfunction in ways that suggested intimate knowledge of their procedures. "Their tactical teams are getting frustrated," Officer Rodriguez observed. "They're trained for direct confrontation, not this kind of invisible resistance. They can't fight what they can't see." Through the diner's windows, they watched more gang members arrive, but their presence no longer carried the same intimidation. Each new arrival stretched their resources thinner, created more vulnerabilities in their security. "They're not just being attacked," Amirah realized, watching the gang's increasingly chaotic movements. "They're being herded. Every reaction, every response is being channeled towards something." Jack nodded approvingly at his daughter's observation. "Green Berets don't just fight battles. We shape battlefields. Everything they do now is predictable because they're operating on training I understand better than they do." The morning progressed with more systematic disruptions. The gang's medical supplies were mysteriously rerouted for quality inspection. Their fuel deliveries were cancelled due to regulatory concerns. Every carefully constructed layer of their operation was being methodically exposed and dismantled. "Found 4 of their suppliers tied up behind the gas station," Tom reported. "Professional restraints, military grade. No injuries, just contained, along with detailed files of their gun-running operations." Iron Thorn gathered his core team in the old mill, his voice carrying traces of growing panic. "Someone's in our heads," he told his lieutenants, "using our own tactics against us. This isn't random interference. This is special forces methodology." Amirah watched the gang's deteriorating discipline with a mixture of awe and satisfaction. The men who'd terrorized her, who'd made her feel powerless, were now experiencing what real powerlessness felt like. "They're breaking," Mrs. Hayes noted, monitoring gang communications. The professional ones recognize the tactics. The others are just getting scared. Jack maintained his position at Chen's diner, coordinating their network of observers while appearing to simply enjoy coffee with his daughter. "Remember what I taught you about pressure points?" he asked Sarah. "In combat and in bodies, the right pressure applied precisely can neutralize the strongest opponent." The Shadow Riders had brought their version of military expertise to Pine Valley Springs, thinking their training made them invincible. Instead, they found themselves facing a master of their own tactics, someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of dismantling exactly this kind of operation. "Phase 2 begins at sunset," Jack announced to his network of observers. "They brought warfare to a peaceful town. Let's show them what real warfare looks like." Through the windows, Iron Thorn's increasingly frantic movements betrayed his growing understanding. The Shadow Riders weren't just facing resistance, they were being systematically taken apart by someone who knew exactly how they thought, how they operated, and how to turn their every strength into a weakness. The gang had started this war, thinking their military training made them unstoppable. They were about to learn why Green Berets were considered masters of unconventional warfare, and why targeting a Special Forces veteran's daughter was a mistake. They'd never forget. The first physical evidence of Jack Roundhouse's counter-operation appeared at midnight. The Shadow Riders' communication center in the old mill had been systematically dismantled, not destroyed, but precisely disassembled. Each component was laid out in perfect military order, with detailed annotations about its security vulnerabilities. "He's sending a message," Iron Thorn growled, surveying the meticulous display, "showing us he can reach anything, anywhere, anytime." His military training recognized the precision of the operation. No forced entries, no alarms triggered, just professional infiltration and execution. Through Chen's diner's windows, Amirah watched the gang's increasingly erratic movements. Their morning patrols, once precise and intimidating, now carried an edge of paranoia. Every shadow held potential threats. Every civilian might be part of Roundhouse's network. 3 more quit last night, Lisa reported, bringing coffee to their usual table. All former military. They recognized the tactics being used against them, said it reminded them too much of their combat training, made them question what they'd become. Jack absorbed the information with quiet satisfaction. The Shadow Riders had brought military precision to Pine Valley Springs, never expecting to encounter someone who understood psychological warfare at a deeper level. "Their weapon caches are disappearing," Officer Rodriguez announced during their morning briefing. "Not stolen, systematically relocated. Each piece tagged and documented, evidence carefully preserved for federal authorities." Through the windows, they watched Iron Thorn inspect another compromised storage location. His face showed the strain of command under pressure, the frustration of a military man being outmaneuvered at his own game. "Found their tactical playbook," Mrs. Hayes reported, spreading documents across their table. "Detailed plans for taking over small towns, psychological profiles, systematic methods for breaking community resistance." They weren't just criminals. They were running a military-style insurgency. Amirah studied her father's expression as he reviewed the intelligence. The quiet parent who'd taught her about courage had been replaced by the warrior who'd spent decades mastering the art of dismantling enemy operations. "Their entire supply network is going dark," Tom Marshall added, joining their gathering. "Key contacts disappearing, routes compromised, safe houses exposed. Someone's documenting everything, building an ironclad case for federal prosecution." Iron Thorn's voice carried across the street as he berated another failed security team. Find out how they're getting past our perimeter. These are professional penetration tactics. Someone with serious combat experience is taking us apart, piece by piece. The morning brought more evidence of systematic dismantling. The gang's fuel supplies were mysteriously contaminated. Their surveillance equipment developed inexplicable blind spots. Each carefully constructed layer of their operation was being methodically exposed and neutralized. "Got their personnel files," Lisa whispered, bringing another update. "Most of their core group, they're all dishonorably discharged veterans. Special Forces, Rangers, Marines, all with combat experience, all with disciplinary issues. Lost men looking for the structure they had in service." Jack nodded, understanding the psychology at play. They're dangerous because they're trained, but vulnerable because they've forgotten their true purpose. Real warriors protect, they don't terrorize. Through the diner's windows, they watched more Shadow Riders arrive, but their presence felt different now. Each new member stretched their resources thinner, created more gaps in their security, more opportunities for invisible opponents to exploit. Their command structures falling apart, Officer Rodriguez observed. The professional ones recognize what's happening. The others are just getting scared. They came here thinking their training made them invincible. Now that same training is showing them exactly how vulnerable they are. Ironthorn gathered his remaining loyal forces, his voice carrying traces of desperation. "Someone's in our heads, using our own tactics against us. This isn't random resistance. This is Special Forces methodology. Find out how Roundhouse is doing this." Amirah watched the gang's deteriorating discipline with growing understanding. "You're not just fighting them," she told her father. "You're making them fight themselves." Jack's smile carried quiet satisfaction. "Best way to defeat an enemy is to make them doubt their own strength." They brought military tactics to a peaceful town. Now they're learning why those tactics were designed for real warriors, not thugs with training. The morning progressed with more systematic disruptions. The gang's medical supplies were mysteriously rerouted. Their fuel deliveries were cancelled due to regulatory concerns. Every carefully constructed layer of their operation was being methodically exposed and dismantled. "Found their financial records," Mrs. Hayes reported, her librarian's skills now focused on intelligence analysis. Shell companies, money laundering operations, everything documented and forwarded to federal authorities. Their entire criminal enterprise is being systematically exposed. Through the windows, they watched Ironthorn's increasingly frantic movements. The former Special Forces operator recognized the methodology being used against him. The same techniques he'd once employed in combat now turned against his criminal operation. "Their tactical teams are breaking down," Tom observed. "Professional soldiers know when they're being outmaneuvered. The ones with real combat experience are starting to recognize what they've become, and they don't like what they see." Jack maintained his position at Chen's diner, coordinating their network of observers while appearing to simply enjoy coffee with his daughter. "Remember what I taught you about psychological warfare?" he asked Sarah. "The strongest enemy can be defeated by making them doubt their own strength." The Shadow Riders had brought their version of military expertise to Pine Valley Springs, thinking their training made them invincible. Instead, they found themselves facing a master of psychological warfare, someone who understood exactly how to turn their military pride into a weapon against them. "Phase 3 begins at nightfall," Jack announced quietly to his network of observers. "They brought their version of warfare to a peaceful town. Let's show them what real Special Forces operations feel like." Through the windows, Ironthorn's increasingly desperate movements betrayed his growing understanding. The Shadow Riders weren't just facing resistance, they were being systematically dismantled by someone who knew exactly how they thought, how they operated, and how to turn their every strength into a weakness. The gang had started this war thinking their military training made them unstoppable. They were about to learn why Green Berets were considered masters of psychological warfare and why targeting a Special Forces veteran's daughter was a mistake that would destroy everything they'd built. The Shadow Riders launched their first major offensive at dawn, but their coordinated attack revealed more desperation than strategy. 30 bikes roared through Pine Valley Springs, their riders now wearing full tactical gear instead of leather vests. They'd brought their entire arsenal, determined to crush any resistance with overwhelming force. "Predictable," Jack Roundhouse observed from Chen's diner, watching the gang's movements with professional assessment. "They're falling back on basic training, show of force, shock, and awe. But they're making rookie mistakes." Amirah noticed the flaws her father had taught her to recognize: gaps in their formation, exposed flanks, communication lapses that spoke of growing disorganization. The gang's military precision had cracked under the strain of invisible resistance. "Multiple breach teams approaching from the north," Officer Rodriguez reported through their secure channel. "They're targeting key buildings, town hall, police, station, major businesses, but something's wrong with their coordination." Through the diner's windows, they watched Iron Thorn direct his forces, but his commands seemed to get garbled in transmission. Radio frequencies crossed, tactical plans. Confused, carefully planned assaults dissolved into chaos. "Got their attack plans," Mrs. Hayes announced, joining them with fresh intelligence. "Someone accessed their secure server. Every move they're making was compromised before they started. They're walking into their own countermeasures." Jack nodded with quiet satisfaction. The Shadow Riders had brought their version of military tactics to Pine Valley Springs, never expecting to encounter someone who'd mastered psychological warfare at a deeper level. 3 teams down at the North Checkpoint, Lisa reported, bringing coffee and intelligence updates. Found them zip-tied with their own restraints, professional work, pressure points and joint locks. They never even saw who hit them. Iron Thorn's voice carried traces of panic as he tried to restore order. "Something's wrong. Our communications are compromised. Our equipment's failing. Our teams are going dark. Find out how they're doing this." The morning brought more evidence of systematic dismantling. The gang's weapon caches had been relocated, their surveillance, equipment disabled, their tactical advantages turned against them with professional precision. Their command structures collapsing, Tom Marshall observed from his position at the hardware store. The professional soldiers recognize what's happening. They're being outmaneuvered by someone who knows their playbook better than they do. Amirah watched her father coordinate their network of observers, seeing not just the protective parent, but the warrior who'd spent decades mastering the art of unconventional warfare. "You're not just defeating them," she realized. "You're teaching them why their training was meant for better things." Through the diner's windows, they watched more Shadow Riders arrive. But each new member seemed to create more confusion than strength. Their tactical formations broke down, their communication channels crossed, their military discipline crumbled under invisible pressure. "Found their intelligence files," Officer Rodriguez reported, bringing another update. "Detailed profiles of every business in town, threat assessments, vulnerability analysis, all being forwarded to federal authorities. Their entire operation is being documented and dismantled." Iron Thorn gathered his remaining loyal forces, his voice carrying the edge of command under pressure. "Someone's inside our network, using our own tactics against us. This isn't random resistance. This is Special Forces methodology. Roundhouse is not just fighting us, he's destroying everything we've built." The morning progressed with more systematic disruptions. The gang's fuel supplies were contaminated, their medical supplies rerouted, their tactical advantages neutralized. One by one, every carefully constructed layer of their operation was being methodically exposed and disabled. "Their professional soldiers are breaking ranks," Mrs. Hayes noted, monitoring gang communications. "The ones with real combat experience recognize what's happening. They're being dismantled by someone who understands military operations at a higher level. Jack maintained his position at Chen's diner, coordinating their network of observers, while appearing to simply enjoy coffee with his daughter. "Remember what I taught you about force multiplication?" he asked Sarah. "One well-trained operator can neutralize superior numbers by using their own strength against them." Through the windows, they watched Iron Thorn's increasingly desperate attempts to maintain control. The former Special Forces operator recognized the methodology being used against him. The same techniques he'd once employed in combat now turned against his criminal enterprise. "Their tactical teams are falling apart," Lisa reported during another update. "Professional soldiers know when they're being outmaneuvered. The ones with real combat experience are starting to question their loyalties, remembering why they wore the uniform in the first place. The Shadow Riders launched another coordinated assault, but their military precision had been replaced by desperate aggression. Each attack was met with invisible resistance. Their tactical advantages turned against them, their superior numbers made meaningless by strategic countermeasures." "Found their command center compromised," Tom announced through their secure channel. "Someone accessed their tactical planning room, left detailed annotations about every vulnerability in their security. They're not just being defeated, they're being educated." Amirah watched the gang's deteriorating discipline with growing understanding. The men who'd terrorized her, who'd made her feel powerless, were now experiencing what real military expertise felt like. Not used for intimidation, but for systematic dismantling of corrupt power. "Their entire network is exposed," Officer Rodriguez added, reviewing intelligence reports. "Supply lines, communication channels, financial operations, everything documented and forwarded to federal authorities. They're not just losing a battle, they're losing their entire organization." Jack coordinated their network of observers with quiet efficiency, his military training evident in every precise countermeasure. The Shadow Riders had brought their version of warfare to Pine Valley Springs, never expecting to encounter someone who understood psychological warfare at its deepest level. "Phase 4 begins at sunset," he announced to his network of observers. "They brought their corruption of military training to a peaceful town. Let's show them why that training was meant for protection, not predation." Through the windows, Iron Thorn's increasingly frantic movements betrayed his growing understanding. The Shadow Riders weren't just facing resistance, they were being systematically dismantled by someone who knew exactly how they thought, how they operated, and how to turn their every strength into a weakness. The gang had started this war, thinking their military training made them unstoppable. They were about to learn why Green Berets were considered masters of psychological warfare, and why targeting a Special Forces veteran's daughter was a mistake that would destroy not just their operation, but their entire corrupt understanding of what military training was meant to achieve. The truth about the Shadow Riders' operation broke on a Tuesday morning when Mrs. Hayes discovered the crucial link: money trails, shell companies, and corrupt officials, all connected back to a single source, a private military consulting firm specializing in turning dishonorably discharged veterans into organized criminal enterprises. "Look at this." She spread documents across their table at Chen's diner. Every failed soldier they recruited, every corrupt official they paid, every operation they planned, it all leads back to Iron Thorn's former Special Forces unit. They weren't just building a gang, they were creating a private army. Jack studied the evidence with professional interest, seeing patterns that spoke of military precision corrupted to criminal purpose. "They're using Pine Valley Springs as a testing ground," he observed. "Prove they can control an entire community through militarized intimidation, then expand their operation nationwide." Through the diner's windows, they watched more Shadow Riders arrive, but their presence had changed. The leather vests and gang patches had been replaced by tactical gear and military-style equipment. They weren't pretending anymore. This was An army preparing for war. Got their personnel files, Officer Rodriguez reported during their morning briefing. Over 60% of their members are former military, special forces, rangers, marines, all with combat experience, all with disciplinary issues. They're recruiting warriors and turning them into predators. Amirah watched her father absorb the information, seeing the tactical commander emerge more fully. The Green Beret who'd defended her at Carter's Market was now fighting a different kind of battle, not just protecting his daughter, but trying to save corrupted soldiers from themselves. Their training programs are sophisticated, Tom Marshall added, bringing more intelligence. They're not just teaching combat skills, they're systematically breaking down military discipline and rebuilding it into something darker, taking everything these men learned about protection and twisting it into predation. Iron Thorne's voice carried across the street as he coordinated another tactical operation, but his commands held an edge of desperation. His carefully constructed military organization was being dismantled by someone who understood its foundations too well. Found their recruitment files, Lisa reported quietly. They specifically target veterans struggling with civilian life. Promise them the structure and purpose they miss from service, then corrupt everything they once stood for. It's not just criminal, it's psychological warfare against lost soldiers. Jack's expression hardened as he reviewed the documents. The Shadow Riders weren't just building a criminal empire. They were systematically destroying everything the military was meant to represent, turning protectors into predators with calculated precision. Their network is bigger than we thought, Mrs. Hayes announced, her research skills uncovering deeper connections. Similar operations in 12 states, all using the same model. Target small towns, insert corrupted veterans, establish military-style control. Pine Valley Springs was supposed to be their showcase, prove their methodology works. Through the windows, they watched more gang members arrive, but now they could see the military bearing beneath the criminal veneer. Men who'd once sworn to protect turned into instruments of intimidation, their training twisted into tools of terror. Their command structure is pure special forces, Officer Rodriguez observed, studying patrol patterns. Cell organization, compartmentalized intelligence, tactical flexibility. Iron Thorne isn't just running a gang, he's building an insurgency on American soil. Jack coordinated with his network of observers, his own military experience now focused on saving men who'd lost their way. They're not just criminals, he explained to Sarah. They're lost warriors who forgot what their training was for. Some need to be stopped, others need to be reminded. The morning brought more revelations about the depth of the Shadow Riders' operation. Their influence reached into local government, law enforcement, even veterans support services. Everything designed to further isolate and corrupt soldiers struggling to find their place. Got their training manuals, Tom reported grimly. They're using modified special forces protocols, taking everything we learned about protecting communities and perverting it into methods of control. It's like reading a twisted mirror version of our own tactics. Iron Thorne gathered his command staff in the old mill, their discussion carrying traces of growing panic. Someone's not just fighting us, they're exposing us. Everything we've built, every connection we've made, every soldier we've turned. Roundhouse isn't just dismantling our operation, he's showing everyone what we've become. Amirah watched the systematic exposure of the Shadow Riders' true nature with growing understanding. You're not just fighting their organization, she told her father. You're fighting for the soul of every soldier they've corrupted. Jack nodded, his tactical expertise now serving a deeper purpose. Sometimes the best way to defeat an enemy is to remind them of who they were meant to be. These men weren't born criminals. They were warriors who lost their way. Some can find it again. Through the diner's windows, they watched more Shadow Riders arrive, but now they could see the conflict in some faces. Men who joined seeking the brotherhood of military service, now forced to confront how far they'd strayed from everything that service was meant to represent. Their entire operational doctrine is exposed, Mrs. Hayes reported, bringing more files. Training programs, psychological manipulation, systematic corruption of military principles. They're not just building criminal enterprises, they're destroying everything the uniform stands for. Jack studied the evidence with the eyes of someone who'd spent decades upholding those principles. The Shadow Riders had brought their corruption of military service to Pine Valley Springs, never expecting to encounter someone who understood not just the tactics, but the deeper purpose behind them. Phase 5 begins at nightfall, he announced, to his network of observers. They brought their perversion of military training to a peaceful town. Let's show them why that training was meant for something better. Through the windows, Ironthorn's increasingly desperate movements betrayed his growing understanding. The Shadow Riders weren't just facing tactical defeat. They were being forced to confront the true nature of what they'd become, and some of them couldn't bear the reflection. The gang had started this war thinking their military training made them invincible. They were about to learn why Green Berets were considered masters not just of warfare, but of redemption. Why targeting a Special Forces veteran's daughter wasn't just a tactical mistake, but a moral one that would expose everything they'd tried to hide, even from themselves. 1 month after the battle for Pine Valley Springs, Amirah Roundhouse walked confidently down Main Street, her head held high, as she headed toward Carter's Market. The autumn leaves still danced along the sidewalk, but everything else had changed. Where fear had once ruled, hope now grew. 3 more rehabilitation centers opening this week, Mrs. Hayes reported during their morning briefing at Chen's Diner. State funding approved for expansion into major cities. What started here is spreading faster than we can track. Jack, taking a brief break from his private security consulting, sat with his daughter watching the town's transformation. Former enemies now worked together, their military training redirected toward protection rather than intimidation. "Got the final numbers," Officer Rodriguez announced, joining them with fresh reports. Over 40 former Shadow Riders have entered rehabilitation programs, most of them veterans who saw what real strength looks like here. They're not just leaving the gang, they're helping dismantle similar operations across the state. Chen's Diner had become more than just a gathering place. It was now officially designated as a veteran support center, where former criminals could find their way back to the warriors they were meant to be. Medical Board approved our expanded program, Tom Marshall shared, reviewing the latest documents. Using our success here as a model for treating combat veterans who've fallen into criminal life, healing bodies and spirits together. Through the windows, they watched construction crews rebuilding damaged structures. Former Shadow Riders worked alongside townspeople they'd once terrorized, their military precision now directed at restoration. Instead of destruction. Latest intelligence update, Mrs. Hayes announced, scanning her laptop. Criminal organizations are losing their veteran recruits. Our example is making it harder for them to exploit military training for violence. They can't hide the truth anymore about what they're really doing to lost soldiers. Amirah observed the morning traffic. Normal routines resumed, but with a deeper appreciation for the transformation they'd witnessed. They thought breaking me would break our spirit, she reflected. Instead, it broke their power over people seeking redemption. State police want to implement our training program, Officer Rodriguez added. Teaching departments how to work with reformed gang members, how to recognize the difference between those wanting change and those refusing it. Your father's methods are becoming standard procedure. Lisa served coffee to another group of veterans, seeking help. The diner now famous as the place where redemption proved stronger than revenge. Every person we help, she noted, becomes living proof that change is possible, that it's never too late to remember who you were meant to be. Jack shared updates from his military contacts. Other Special Forces units are studying what happened here, he explained, learning how to fight criminal organizations, not just with force, but with understanding. Sometimes the strongest weapon against corruption is remembering your true purpose. Mrs. Hayes's research had become a manual for other communities. We're not just stopping criminal activities, she explained. We're cutting off their access to military-trained recruits, showing veterans a better way to find purpose. Every person we help reform weakens their ability to recruit. Through the diner's windows, they watched more vehicles arrive. Not gang members this time, but representatives from other towns seeking to learn from their example. The transformation of Pine Valley Springs had become a blueprint for communities. Facing similar challenges, word from the Federal Task Force, Officer Rodriguez reported, using our evidence to dismantle criminal networks across 3 states, but more importantly, offering rehabilitation to any veterans involved. The focus is on recovery, not just punishment. Tom led another orientation session for newcomers seeking change. We don't just offer redemption, he told them. We offer purpose, the chance to protect instead of destroy, to become who you were trained to be. The skills that made you dangerous can make you incredible protectors. The morning brought more signs of transformation. Former enemies shared coffee and stories, their past conflicts transformed into shared wisdom about the path to redemption. The cycle of violence had been broken, replaced by a cycle of hope. Rehabilitation success rate is remarkable, Mrs. Hayes noted, reviewing statistics. Over 80% of veteran participants maintaining their transformation, proof that military training can be redirected back to its true purpose. They just needed someone to show them the way. Amirah watched another group of veterans arrive seeking help, remembering the moment violence had tried to break her spirit. Real strength, she observed, isn't in causing fear. It's in offering hope, even to those who once tried to destroy it. Lisa, now coordinating with Veteran Medical Services, shared her own observations. The same skills that made them dangerous, she noted, now make them incredible protectors. They just needed to remember their true purpose, to find their way back to who they were meant to be. As noon approached, Jack prepared for his next consulting assignment, but this time with a new mission. What happened here, he told Sarah, isn't just about one town's victory. It's about proving that redemption is stronger than revenge. That it's never too late to choose a better path. Mrs. Hayes's laptop chimed with more requests for assistance. Other communities are facing the same challenges we did, she reported, but now they have a blueprint for transformation instead of just enforcement. They're learning that some of their best potential protectors are the ones who found their way back from the wrong path. The day continued with more evidence of lasting change. Former criminals protected their community with professional discipline. Reformed gang members mentored others seeking transformation. The power of redemption had proved stronger than the pull of corruption. Jack watched his daughter move confidently through town, seeing not just her physical healing, but her role in something larger. The Shadow Riders had targeted her thinking. She was vulnerable, never realizing their cruelty would spark a movement of transformation that would spread far beyond Pine Valley Springs. Your father did something remarkable, Officer Rodriguez told Sarah. He didn't just break a criminal organization. He created a path for lost warriors to find their way home. Every person who chooses rehabilitation over revenge weakens the hold these gangs have on veterans seeking purpose. Through the diner's windows, they watched another group of former Shadow Riders working on community projects, their military precision now serving the town they'd once terrorized. The transformation that began with one act of cruelty had become something powerful enough to change lives across the nation. The sun set on Pine Valley Springs, illuminating a community that had faced destruction and found transformation instead. The town had not just survived, it had become living proof that redemption was possible for anyone brave enough to choose it. Amirah and Jack walked home together through streets where fear had once ruled, now filled with hope. The war for Pine Valley Springs had ended, but its impact continued spreading. They had proved that real strength wasn't in breaking things, but in restoring them, not in causing fear, but in offering hope, not in revenge, but in redemption. The transformation that began with one girl's courage and her father's wisdom had become something powerful enough to change not just a town, but lives across the nation. And it all started because some men thought terrorizing a teenage girl would break her spirit. Instead, it had broken their own chains, setting them free to become the warriors they were always meant to be, protectors instead of predators, guardians. Instead of criminals, living proof that it's never too late to choose a better path. The final sunrise over Pine Valley Springs revealed a town forever changed, but not in the way the Shadow Riders had intended. Where they'd brought fear, hope, now flourished. The transformation that began with Amirah Roundhouse's courage and her father's wisdom had sparked something unprecedented. 3 months after the battle, Chen's diner buzzed with activity. Veterans from across the country sought help through the rehabilitation program, which had become a national model. Former Shadow Riders, now community protectors, helped guide others away from the dark path they'd once walked. Got reports from 5 more towns, Officer Rodriguez shared during their morning briefing. Criminal organizations are losing their hold on veteran recruits. What started here has become a movement. Jack Roundhouse, still coordinating the program between his security consulting missions, watched his daughter serve coffee to a group of reformed veterans. Amirah moved with confidence now, her previous fears transformed into strength that inspired others. Every person we help, she told her father, becomes proof that real strength isn't about causing fear, it's about offering hope. Through the diner's windows, they watched former enemies working together to rebuild their community. The Shadow Riders had brought their version of warfare to Pine Valley Springs, thinking their military training made them invincible. Instead, they'd encountered something stronger, the power of redemption and the true meaning of warrior spirit. They thought breaking me would break our spirit, Amirah reflected, standing proud beside her father. Instead, it broke their power over lost soldiers seeking purpose. The town had not just survived, it had become living proof that it's never too late to choose a better path, that real strength lies not in causing fear, but in offering hope for transformation. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot to us.